All right, if you have your Bibles, turn to Jeremiah 20. I am reading out of the New Revised Standard Version, with lots of sticky notes hanging out. I'm going to be reading a good bit of the chapter, verses 1 through 13. We're going to break it up into 3 different segments. So read with me, if you will, from Jeremiah chapter 20, starting in verse 1. Now the priest Pashur, son of Immer, who was chief officer in the house of the Lord, heard Jeremiah prophesying these things. Then Pashur struck the prophet Jeremiah and put him in the stocks that were in the upper Benjamin gate of the house of the Lord. The next morning, when Pashur released Jeremiah from the stocks, Jeremiah said to him, "The Lord has named you not Pashur, but terror all around. For thus says the Lord, I am making you a terror to yourself and to all your friends, and they shall fall by the sword of their enemies while you look on. And I will give all Judah into the hand of the king of Babylon. He shall carry them captive to Babylon and shall kill them with the sword." We're going to keep going through verse 6. So we're at verse 5 right now. "I will give all the wealth of this city, all its gains, all its prized belongings, and all the treasures of the kings of Judah into the hand of their enemies, who shall plunder them and seize them and carry them to Babylon. And you, Pashur, and all who live in your house shall go into captivity and to Babylon. You shall go there, you shall die. And there you shall be buried, you and all your friends to whom you have prophesied falsely." Have you ever had a job that you didn't want to do? Have you ever tried to tell a king or a priest that they're going to be taken captive for their abuse of power? Hold on to that phrase, abuse of power. Have you ever been called to confront an authority? Maybe a racist police officer, maybe an unaccounted judge, or a judge not held accountable. Now, the context in this passage is that Babylon had been invaded and defeated Syria, who had previously taken over Jerusalem. There's a constant change of command. Sound familiar? There's a constant change of command, and each takeover presents a different cultural shift, expecting the Jewish people to divert further and further from the life that they believed to be right. Now, in this section, there are 3 sections. There are 3 lessons I'd like for you to consider from this chapter of Jeremiah 20. The first one is that bad happens to good people. You read in this passage about how Jeremiah was called to confront authority. You read in this passage about how Jeremiah was struck and put in stocks. But what it does not say in this passage is that he was thrown into prison for 11 years. Jeremiah is the only prophet named among the many who preached in Jerusalem in 600 BC. He was a prophet during one of the many seasons when war and conquest were the theme of the day. Babylon had invaded and defeated Assyria, who had previously taken over Jerusalem. 11 years Jeremiah sat in prison when he did nothing wrong. Does that sound familiar to our culture today? Consider this. Nelson Mandela. How many of you know how many years Nelson Mandela was in prison? He was locked up for 27 years of his life, and he never physically recovered from that abuse. The East Los Angeles walkouts, or the Chicana blowouts, were a series of 1968 protests by Chicano students whose unequal conditions in the Los Angeles Unified School District high schools. In 1968, after critically analyzing what they were being taught in public schools, students' walkouts occurred in Denver and East LA and even in Texas. And in Texas, many students were jailed by the county. Please understand that bad happens to good people. Bad is not always a result of sin. We have this bad habit, especially in theological circles, of mistaking negative parts of life with judgment. Look at John chapter 9, or reflect on John chapter 9, when the disciples asked Christ, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? What was Christ's response? He said, neither. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. Now, when I think of the work of God being displayed in someone's life, I think of the very first tattoo that I had placed on my back right shoulder blade. It was when I was living overseas, and it's written in another language, and it references Job. Because in Job 5:8, one of his rather odd friends reminded him of something he had said in the past. And we need that from time to time. From time to time, we need that reminder of what we said in the past, what we believed in the past, what we believed in what we lived in the past. Or maybe we need to be reminded of people in our past who have influenced us, people in our past who have gone on to eternity, who have left a legacy with us. What did his friend tell him in Job 5:8? He said, I would seek unto God, and unto God will I commit my cause. Consider Job. God didn't do anything to him, but we get caught up in the fact that God could have stopped Job's trials, and we miss that God didn't do it. We hold God accountable so often for the mistakes that we've made and the happenstances in our lives, the offenses from other people, and it's neither fair or right to do so. But it is the mindset that we find in this passage in Jeremiah. Now, I want to go back to Jeremiah chapter 20 because there's more to learn from this passage. We're going to pick up with verse 7, and we're just going to read until verse 10. Jeremiah 20, verse 7. O Lord, you have enticed me, and I was enticed, just in case you didn't catch. That's what he has to say, enticed. You have overpowered me, and you have prevailed. I have become a laughingstock all day long. Everyone mocks me. For whenever I speak, I must cry out. I must shout violence and destruction. For the word of the Lord has become for me a reproach and derision all day long. If I say I will not mention him or speak any more in his name, then within me there is something like a burning fire shut up in my bones. I am weary with holding it in, and I cannot. For I hear many whispering, terror is all around. Denounce him. Let us denounce him. All my close friends are watching for me to stumble. Perhaps he can be enticed, and we can prevail against him and take our revenge on him. Verse 7 starts with an accusation. You deceived me, God. It is said that Jeremiah was compelled to his prophetic work. He had not desired it, and he had not pursued it. But the second lesson that I want you to grab, first of all, bad happens to good people. And secondly, it is acceptable to complain to God. I liken this unto race in this day and age. Something that should be a matter of pride is hated by others, maybe even begrudged by the person experiencing. Jeremiah starts by pointing his finger at the one who made him this way, screaming, it's your fault. Jeremiah was even saying that God had tricked him, taken advantage of him. It is easy for another to hear this and judge the relationship between Jeremiah and God. But we are reminded that laments are a God-given way for us to make a situation more open for God, to give God more room to work in our lives. Remember that statement that Christ made about the blind man? This happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. It is acceptable to complain to God. You don't have to deny your feelings. Matthew 27:46 and Mark 15:34 tell us that in the 9th hour, Jesus cried out. Where was Christ when he cried out with a loud voice saying, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani? He was on the cross. What ultimate persecution, what ultimate grief, what ultimate sorrow could supersede this type of physical torture, the humiliation and the shame? What he said is, my God, why have you forsaken me? He acknowledged the feeling that he experienced from God turning his back on this scene. 1 Peter 5:7 tells us how to respond. Cast all your cares on God, for he cares for you. Now, this is a very familiar verse, but you can't cast cares if you haven't acknowledged that they exist. You can't cast cares if you're denying them. So you don't have to deny your feelings. This verse in 1 Peter 5:7, it kind of brings me to do a little bit of study. And you know that I enjoy comparative religions. Did you know that in Islam, there are 99 names for God? One of them is the sustainer. The sustainer. And that's what this verse in the Christian Bible is telling us about God. If God didn't want to hear your complaints, he wouldn't have told you to cast your cares on him. But we make the mistake of taking human characteristics and putting them onto God. Because a lot of us have experienced those people who say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Please let me know if there's anything that I can do to help. Please let me know." And then you start talking and they start walking. Because they don't actually want to hear what you have to say. We deny our feelings because when we do this to humans, when we share our feelings with humans, a lot of times they don't actually want to be there as a part of your life. And a lot of us have experienced this, and it affects how we perceive God. It affects how we envision God's response. When he says, "Cast all your cares on him," it sounds a little bit like that person who comforted us in a time of grief. Let me know if there's anything that I can do. But God does not respond that way. Those words from 1 Peter come out of the Hebrew Bible. Psalm 55 verse 22. Cast your burden on the Lord. Sound familiar? Cast your burden on the Lord. He will support you. He will sustain you. God is our sustainer. He does not respond to us as humans do, because he's not human. In the heavens, God, our creator, our father, as some are or want to say, he is our sustainer. He will support you, and support comes from underneath. Sustenance comes from underneath, and it goes into, just like our food is our sustenance. It is not something that we reject. It is something we require. And God has told us that it is acceptable to complain to God. There's one more lesson I want you to see from Jeremiah chapter 20. We've talked about how bad happens to good people. Christ taught that. We've talked about how it is acceptable to complain to God. But what is it, aside from that complaining, aside from that lament, what is it that we're supposed to do? I think it's very important that we have to recognize that others' opinion of us bow to God's opinion of us. Have you ever heard somebody tell you that they're going to give you a piece of their mind? "I'm going to give you a piece of my mind." Please don't. You don't have enough to share. Keep it. The second part of Jeremiah's complaint in this verses 7 through 10 that we just read, it's about other people. He was suffering from a lot of social rejection and struggling to hold on to his true identity as he was mocked. The people took his rebuke of leadership and used it against him. This is parallel to the contemporary courts, where cunning and craft do the exact same thing. Take another's words and twist them, looking to use human error for the greatest negative impact, the greatest human profit. Many a person in today's society can relate to Jeremiah's experience. If you haven't, check out the stories, the faces of injustice that are connected to the Women's Coalition. Just planting that seed. Jeremiah later claims that everyone is watching just to see him mess up. Have you ever felt like that? That every step you take was being calculated? Terence Freitham wrote that Jeremiah was stuck between an insistent God and a resistant people, which certainly does sound much like the trick Jeremiah referred to. when he accused God of that deception, when he accused God of that enticement. It sounds a lot like being stuck between an insistent God and a resistant people. Humanity has struggled with humanity since the beginning. Think of Cain and Abel, the brother who killed his brother because of jealousy. I'm going to give you some names. Tell me if you recognize them. Michael Brown. Michael Brown was killed by police, and that was the beginning of the Ferguson protests. Sound familiar? Does that sound like being caught between an insistent God and a resistant people? Where someone who is either doing nothing wrong or doing something right. I'm not saying that any one person was doing something right, but in not doing something wrong, he got caught. He got caught between the God, the Creator, and that humanity, that struggle with humanity that has always been. Here's another name. Luis Omar Ocasio-Capo. Maybe that one's not as familiar because he was one of 49 people who was murdered. This was in the Pulse nightclub shooting. Complete hatred against people. Very recently, I read an article about a 14-year-old who, with friends, joyriding in a parent's car without permission. I feel like some of the older generation are gonna chuckle at the memory of having done something similar to this. But this is how it ends in today's era. A car alarm goes off. I think it was the stolen car taken from the parents without permission. And a child's phone flashes, which confuses a campus police for gunfire. And what happens but that 14-year-old boy gets shot in the head. This is out of New Orleans, the 22nd of April, 2020, just 2 days ago. Matthew 16, verses 24 through 26 say that Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? Believers exist in this world, worldwide, across the globe, who are treated with this type of indecency and abuse simply because of their belief. And in these settings, simply because of a miscommunication or a confusion, simply because of an orientation, simply because of the color of someone's skin. There is no excuse for that. Humanity has not changed. In verse 7 in this passage, Jeremiah says, I have become a laughingstock all day long. Everyone mocks me. Verse 10, I hear many people whispering. Whispering, does that sound like the talking behind your back? Verse 10, all of my close friends are watching for me to stumble. You know, I'm reminded of a little saying when we were growing up that you probably heard. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Yes, they do. And they stay with you for many, many, many years. There are people who have not faced the shooting. There are people who may not recall at this time a time that they were a laughingstock or were whispered about, where people were just waiting for them to mess up, which is what Jeremiah was experiencing. But I'm reminded of a poem written by Dorothy Law Nolt, a PhD candidate. I think she wrote it when she was a candidate. It's called Children Learn What They Live. I feel like many teachers have probably heard this, and hopefully many parents have too, but I want to read it to you. If children live with criticism, they learn to condemn. If children live with hostility, they learn to fight. If children live with fear, they learn to be apprehensive. If children live with pity, they learn to feel sorry for themselves. If children live with ridicule, they learn to feel shy. If children live with jealousy, they learn to feel envy. If children live with shame, they learn to feel guilty. And then it switches from the negative that we've been reading about in Jeremiah 20. And this is our transition into what Jeremiah says, starting in verse 11. Look at verse 11. But the Lord. I love this. But the Lord. Now I'm going to go back to this poem because we need to hear what happens when there is a but the Lord moment in our lives. If children live with encouragement, they learn confidence. If children live with tolerance, they learn patience. If children live with praise, they learn appreciation. If children live with acceptance, they learn to love. If children live with approval, they learn to like themselves. If children live with recognition, they learn it is good to have a goal. If children live with sharing, they learn generosity. If children live with honesty, they learn truthfulness. If children live with fairness, they learn justice. If children live with kindness and consideration, they learn respect. If children live with security, they learn to have faith in themselves and in those about them. If children live with friendliness, they learn the Word is a nice place in which to live. That poem is giving us characteristics of who God actually is. God created you for this. Whatever your this is, know that you are fearfully and wonderfully made. That comes out of Psalm 139, verse 14. God's opinion of you is not what other people are saying of you. It is not what the persecutors are expressing. Psalm 18, verse 19 said that God rescued me because he delighted in me. Look back at that poem. That is the praise we give to our children. Romans 15:7 says that God accepts me. 1 Thessalonians 2:4 says that we may speak as those approved by God. Recognition was the next one. Isaiah 49:16 says, Jerusalem, I can never forget you. I have written your name on the palms of my hands. That's from one translation. Another translation says, I've engraven you. Another translation says, I've inscribed your picture on me. Think about it in modern day context. I've already referred to one tattoo, and you know that I have others. Many of you have seen me when I'm in the gym or I'm running, when I'm not wearing the long sleeves, which I usually do if I'm preaching. When I'm teaching, I typically do cover up, because I don't want it to be distracting. It's not distracting to me. It is important parts of my life that are engraven. They are tattooed on me. And there are actually verses that take this verse, Isaiah 49:16, that says that God has our names tattooed on the palm of his hands. Whether it's tattooed or engraven or inscribed, know that I don't get a tattoo unless I've thought about it for at least 6 months. At least. Most of my tattoos have been thought about for at least 6 months before I start saving and never actually get to the point of having enough to pay for it. And those, if you've heard my stories, you know most of the last few I haven't even paid for. They've been generously gifted to me, or I've been able to work them off in various ways. That 6 months time frame is very important to me. People don't get tattoos. Some do. I know some do. But most professionals that I know don't go and get a tattoo unless they've thought about it for a really long time. And when I think about this verse that says God has my name tattooed on the palm of his hand, I think of the time that it takes God to look at who I am, how he's created me to be, what is his opinion of me. That's that 6-month wait period that I force myself to take before I get something permanently put on my body. And the scripture does not say that there's a wait period, but I do think that there's value in understanding that tattoos are very permanent. Whether it's tattooed or engraven, whether it's inscribed or written, the one constant verbiage that comes out of this verse in Isaiah is that it's on the palm of his hand. I don't get hand tattoos. I will probably never get a hand tattoo. I never say never, so I say I probably never will get a hand tattoo because it's a little bit too obvious. But isn't that why we're tattooed on the palm of God's hands? Because it is obvious. What else do we know about the hands of God, God the Son? The hands of God are permanently marred with his forgiveness over us. His love for us are in the palms of his hand. But God the Father, hundreds of years before, has our names tattooed on the palms of his hand because it's obvious, because it's there, because it's presented even when he's not thinking about or referencing us. We are still there. We are a part of him. Our opinions of ourselves and our opinions of us do not dictate what God's opinion of us is. He has our name tattooed on the palm of his hand. I want to return now to that part in Jeremiah 20. I love this part. And this is the best lesson, as far as I can tell. We're gonna start right there with that interjection in verse 11. We're going to read down through the end of verse 13. But the Lord is with me like a dread warrior. Therefore my persecutors will stumble and they will not prevail. They will be greatly shamed, for they will not succeed. Their eternal dishonor will never be forgotten. O Lord of hosts, you test the righteous. You see the heart and the mind. Let me see your retribution upon them, for to you I have committed my cause. Sound familiar? Sounds a lot like Job 5:8. For to you I have committed my cause. Now reading verse 13. Sing to the Lord, praise the Lord, for he has delivered the life of the needy from the hands of the evildoers. Bad happens to good people. It is acceptable to complain to God. And the third lesson I hope you'll take away from this is that we must interject our thought process with truth. You got a miserable job to do that you don't want, but the Lord. You've got a constant change of command and a culture shift to process, but the Lord. Unsupervised authorities are attacking you for doing what's right. Did they put you in stocks? You're sitting in a jail cell for a crime you didn't commit, but the Lord. You're being persecuted for doing right, but the Lord. You've been shot for being black, but the Lord. For being gay, but the Lord. For having a flashing light on your cell phone, really? But the Lord. Humanity has not changed. They're going to mock you. They're going to laugh at you. They're just waiting for you to stumble. But the Lord. Interject with who the Lord is. He is with me. Interject with what the Lord can do. It says right here in the scripture, Jeremiah says, you test and see. Interject, and your grateful responses will come forth with singing and with praise. When T.D. Jakes preached on Jeremiah chapter 1, this was back in 2017, and you might want to look it up on his Facebook profile, T.D. Jakes Ministries, if you'd like. He said, you need to change the headlines over your life. God isn't hurting you. He's positioning you. Now, I've been practicing transcendental meditation. I use YouTube almost every day for a guided meditation. If you get a chance, you might check out a YouTube channel called Motorversity. These are all secular uses of mindfulness and focusing yourself away from what the problem is to what you have in your life right now. Because there's so much to be grateful for. Change the headlines over your life. Proverbs 23 verse 7 says, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. What are you dwelling on? What are you meditating on? What are you thinking on constantly? Is it the problems that you're facing in your day-to-day life? They matter. You can take those to the Lord. It is not wrong to complain to him, but at some point you must interject your thought with the truth of what God is saying of you. Secondly, find a purpose in your struggle. 1 Corinthians 2:9 says that eye has not seen, nor has ear heard, nor have entered into the heart of man the things which God has prepared for those who love him. Isaiah 64 verse 4, since ancient times, no one has heard, no ear has perceived, no eye has seen any God besides you, who acts on behalf of those who wait for them. Do you hear this interjection that, but the Lord in your life? There wasn't anything about Jeremiah personally that granted the experiences he faced. But like the tumultuous political climate of his day, Jeremiah represents the modern victim whose very existence causes a struggle so great that leads to the words of lament expressed in this passage. One commentary I read identified the community as facing ensuing crises of deportation and loss. That's what they were dealing with on a day-to-day basis. I haven't even started talking about deportation yet. We'll get to immigration. That'll come, I promise you. In a country where race, nationality, and classism are often the excused cause for abuse, Jeremiah's words ring ever true from the mouths of those who are trying to live as God created them. In verse 9, Jeremiah recants his calling, saying that he's going to quit being the prophet. It's just not worth it. It's not worth all of the struggles. Do you wake up with those feelings some days? The problem for Jeremiah is that he hasn't been able to stop his work on his own. In fact, he can't contain the message. It burns within him to be spoken. This struggle, along with the political climate, is combined with yet another of his sufferings. Did you know that Jeremiah was ordered not to get married? And my professor said that he may have been having feelings of alienation. Sound familiar in COVID-19 chaos that we're dealing with right now? All of this should be considered when Jeremiah laments his calling and the offenses he suffers from others. One would hope that such praise and positive messaging would lead to the end of suffering itself. But as Jeremiah continues past verse 13, past the point where we've stopped reading, as Jeremiah continues, we see a cycle that shows his lament repeats and continues. While we're focusing on these verses up to 13, it is crucial to recognize what happened after this praise was expressed. After his recognition of God, in the same chapter, Jeremiah cursed the very day he was born. That is to say, he regretted his own life. He did not escape his struggle in that lament. He started over again with the sorrow. I believe this teaches that even in our appropriate recognition of God, we will feel the effects of this life. We cannot get away from them. This cycle permits us to acknowledge God and lament at the same time. Our feelings are not invalid, nor are they eradicated by a right praise. This is where reality of both God and earth come together. The Psalms are filled with King David's laments, his sorrows, his expressions of grief. Even Christ, submitting to the will of the Father, felt and expressed sorrow. Some sorrows cannot be escaped, and some pains cannot be praised away. But this passage shows us the doctrine of free will. We have to choose to see God as he is. We have to choose to see ourselves as God sees us. We have to choose to recognize that our suffering is not always from judgment. God is sovereign and we must persevere. There is consideration for the value of suffering and strength in waiting. To reach those who are unjustly treated, Jeremiah's story may build a sense of solidarity, of realization that injustice has occurred for centuries and that these laments are not wrong to express. Finally, Jeremiah demonstrates a right resolve, recognizing God and praising despite suffering. Have you ever heard the song by Casting Crowns called "I'll Praise You in This Storm"? If you get a chance, look that one up. One of my other favorite songs is a Hillsong United piece called "Even When It Hurts." And while that one starts, I'm just going to reread that passage from Jeremiah chapter 20. I'm going to start in verse 11.
Take this fainted heart.
But the Lord.
Take these tainted heads.
But the Lord is with me like a dread warrior. Therefore, my persecutors will stumble, and they will not prevail. They will be greatly shamed, for they will not succeed. Their eternal dishonor will never be forgotten. O Lord of hosts, you test the righteous. You see the heart and the mind. Let me see your retribution upon them, for to you I have committed my cause. Sing to the Lord. Praise the Lord. For he has delivered the life of the needy from the hands of evildoers. Let it be so. Amen.
I will only sing your praise. Take this mountain